I'm going to see if I can't break these things up into shorter sections. So I always come in intending to go short, and I never do, but we'll see how this works. So it's king and a queen, in case you can't see the caption. It says, there's another hereditary disease that runs in the royal family. Your grandfather was a stubborn fool, your father was a stubborn fool, and you are a stubborn fool. Maybe parts of that actually are hereditary. Is huge swaths of our personality are actually hereditary, which is why you do get these kinds of things that run in families. And passing code for things on was the last thing on the list of the features that living things have. And we've got one more feature, and it's a little bit different. You can take an individual, maybe a couple of individuals, internal organization, response to environment, cellularity, DNA, proteins, capable of reproduction. That one's a little iffy, but most of the stuff on the list are things you can kind of check off with an individual thing. Is this alive? Is this not alive? This does not happen to individuals. This is a population feature over time, the change in a population. So that you start with, right, populations are collections of things that have stuff in common. What evolution does is, okay, you look at a population, you go, so what's a typical member of this population? What's kind of the average member of this population? Evolution shifts that so that after a period of time, your average individual, your typical individual, isn't the same as it was. Sometimes so dramatically that it's a totally different species. You're going to call it something different because it's so radically different from what you had before. That's evolution. So when we say people evolve, that happens with individuals, but that's not evolution the way the biologists talk about it. So the idea for evolution trying to figure out what word to put down here. The old maps where you look at the map and then there'd be an edge of the map where they didn't really know what was on the other, beyond that edge because nobody had explored that. And very often there would be labels, you know, here there be dragons. Why? Well, people were pulling fossil dinosaur bones out of the ground and they look like bones. They look like really, really big bones and nothing like that lived around them. But so far as people understood, the world around them had been formed the way that it was in their day. And so if these things didn't exist here now, they must have moved out fairly recently. So they must be somewhere else. So these giant animals were always expected to be just beyond the edge of the known explored world until there wasn't really any explored world left to go. But that's why they expected at some point to run into dragons, because they didn't think that what they were looking at had been dead for millions of years, had actually been turned to stone. There's some of the other legends about things turning to stone. Tell you a little bit about fossils. Fossils only form under very particular circumstances. Something dies. Okay, step number one. It winds up someplace where it can be buried. That doesn't happen on land very often. Sometimes a sandstorm will bury stuff. There are fossil beds in China that were built that way. But typically, things get buried by settling to the bottom of a body of water and having the sediment collect on top of them. That takes a while. In the meantime, things are chewing on them. And So the soft materials get consumed unless there's something about the water so that things don't easily live there. Some of our best fossils that come from living things that dropped into a body of water where there was no oxygen in the water, so there wasn't a heck of a lot to chew on them. And so they were, and also that provides sediments that are very moldy, very, so you'll get feather impressions and stuff in those kinds of fossils, but that's rare. Typically things settle to the bottom of, the nearshore ocean or an inland sea or a big lake. A little lake, 60 million years from now is gonna be a little hard to find where a little lake used to be. There may be fossils from it, but unless you happen to be digging in the right place at the right time, you're not gonna see it. So sediments form. Very often, a larger animal, by the time the sediments form, things have been chewing on it and it's pulled apart. So what gets buried isn't a whole skeleton. There's a piece here and a piece there and a piece over there. But the hard parts are what survive. Fossils are typically fossils of bones and shells and teeth. And so not a lot of plants get fossilized and not a lot of full forms get fossilized. When we compare fossils, we're mostly comparing bones to bones and teeth to teeth and shells to shells because that's what we got. But it was pretty easy to tell eventually as people learned those pieces that there were things that they were digging up out of the ground that didn't exist anymore. They had relatives, you could find comparisons like we'll talk about in the next 2 chapters from now, but nothing alive. Well, relatives. So maybe these were the ancestors of the things that they're finding today. Well, what happened in the meantime? Did they change over a long period of time? That's where the original idea of evolution came from. That things, the nature of things could change over time. And then it was a question of, well, how does this happen? And we've all heard of Darwin. Darwin was a great thinker, basically ran away from his family as a 19-year-old and traveled the world and made all sorts of notes and started to see patterns, comparing things to other things that were close to one another, but the conditions were different, like an island out from the mainland, where the island was deserty and the mainland was a rainforest, or those sorts of things. And he was the one that originally came up with the idea that these changes are driven by conditions, driven by the environment. And he came up with an idea called evolution by natural selection. Now, this is not the only thing that drives evolution, but it's a big player. If conditions get regularly colder or regularly warmer or regularly drier, or a new predator moves into an area, or for one reason or another a predator goes extinct, those are changes in conditions, and the members of the population, if it gets warmer, then there's certain members of the population that have advantages under those new conditions. Some of them have disadvantages. If you have an advantage, you got better odds of surviving long enough to pass those advantages on to your offspring. If you have disadvantages, there's more chance you're gonna die before you ever make offspring, and they don't get those features. So the features start to reflect what works for those conditions, as long as the conditions stick around. That's the thing, you can't project what evolution is gonna do down the road because you don't know what the conditions are gonna do down the road. This is totally driven by circumstances. And I mentioned a way back that conditions drive evolution, and if conditions don't change, then you don't see a lot of changes. There's like a 2.5 billion year span in the history of the Earth where not a heck of a lot seems to have happened. There were living things, but they didn't do a lot of changing. Doesn't seem like the conditions changed. a lot. And then you got, you know, major changes, and poof, a whole bunch of new forms related to the old forms, but very different because they worked under the new conditions that didn't exist under the old forms. They appeared. So this is very much driven by the conditions change, and the conditions select. The nature of the area selects the winners and the losers. And so the good features become more and more common in the next generation, and the generation after that, and the generation after that, to the point where 20 generations down the road, if the conditions have changed and stayed that way, maybe your average individual is really different than it used to be. That's natural selection. One thing also that Darwin came up with as an idea. Now this again, I'm going to mess with the definitions here, and I'm going to screw around with what it looks like. And that's a terrible pun, I just realized. There's some features that, if the whole idea of evolution is producing more offspring with your features than the other guy, then if you have features that make you a better reproducer, then you're going to produce more offspring with those features than the other guy. It may not affect your survival. It may not be selected by nature based on whether you live or die, but it's selected by reproductive success. Now, when Darwin came up with this idea, sexual reproduction, male-female choice, that sort of thing, that was the only thing anybody knew about. So he came up with this term, and it's a broader term now. Sexual selection is any reproductive advantage, whether you're reproducing sexually or asexually. If you have a reproductive advantage, then there's a very good chance we're going to see that become more and more typical for your population over time, because more and more of your offspring are going to be successful reproducers, and they're going to make more of every generation until they become much more the average than the other guys are. So again, it's selection. It is for features, but it's for reproductive features, not survival features. Okay, I said I'm going to try to cut these things down. That is the list of features for living things. And we've got one more thing in this chapter to cover, because there are some things that maybe are living and maybe aren't. They've been in the news a lot lately. I'm sure you'll recognize what I'm talking about.